By the spring of 1945, the Thousand-Year Reich had roughly 3 weeks left to live. What remained of it was a strip of territory in the center of Europe, squeezed between two advancing armies. To the west, American and British forces had crossed the Rhine and were driving into the German heartland. To the east, the Red Army stood on the Oder River, less than 50 miles from Berlin. The capital itself had been bombed for 3 years. Entire districts had been reduced to standing walls and open sky. And yet the government of Germany was still issuing orders, still promising victory, still sentencing men to death for defeatism. This is the story of how the war in Europe ended. Not with a negotiation, not with a settlement, but with the complete and unconditional collapse of a state. To understand how quickly the end came, we have to go back to the previous winter. In December of 1944, Germany launched one last major offensive in the West. Divisions that had been scraped together from training schools, from the Navy, from the Air Force, attacked through the forests of the Ardennes in Belgium, aiming for the port of Antwerp. Hitler believed that a sharp defeat there might split the Western Allies and buy him time. It failed. The advance was stopped. The salient was flattened, and Germany had spent its last strategic reserve of armor and fuel in the process. Those were exactly the forces that might have defended the Eastern Front. They were not there when the Eastern Front broke. On the 12th of January, 1945, the Red Army launched what became known as the Vistula-Oder Offensive. The scale is difficult to convey. More than 2 million Soviet soldiers attacked along a front hundreds of miles wide, supported by an artillery concentration heavier than anything previously assembled in the war. The German line did not bend, it disintegrated. In roughly 3 weeks, Soviet forces advanced almost 300 miles from central Poland to the banks of the Oder. Warsaw was taken, Krakow was taken. By the first days of February, Marshal Georgy Zhukov's troops were digging in at a place called Kustrin, and Berlin was within artillery range of the next offensive. That same month, at a resort on the Black Sea called Yalta, the leaders of the 3 great Allied powers met to decide what would happen to the country they were about to occupy. Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin agreed that Germany would be divided into occupation zones. They agreed that Berlin, though deep inside the future Soviet zone, would also be divided. They agreed on the framework of a new international organization, which would become the United Nations. Those agreements would shape the next 45 years of European history. But in February of 1945, they were still theoretical. The country being carved up had not yet surrendered. While the diplomats were meeting at Yalta, the air war over Germany was entering its final and most disputed phase. By 1945, the Allied bombing campaign had become overwhelming. German air defenses were shattered, fuel for fighters had almost run out, and bomber formations could cross much of the country with little opposition. On the nights of the 13th and 14th of February, British and then American aircraft attacked the city of Dresden. Dresden was a significant rail and communications hub, but it was also an architectural landmark that had been largely spared until then, and it was crowded with refugees fleeing westward ahead of the Soviet advance. The attack created a firestorm that consumed the historic center of the city. Estimates of the dead varied wildly for decades, inflated first by German propaganda at the time and then by political argument afterwards. A commission of German historians, reporting after years of research in 2010, concluded that around 25,000 people were killed. Dresden became, and remains, the most argued over Allied operation of the European war. Those who defend it point to the rail network running through it and to a country that was still fighting hard. Those who condemn it ask what military purpose was served 10 weeks before the surrender by destroying a city center packed with civilians. That argument has never been settled, and this series is not going to settle it. What is not in dispute is that by February of 1945, Germany had lost the ability to defend its own airspace. In the West, the decisive moment came on the 7th of March. American troops of the 9th Armored Division approached the town of Rhine on the Rhine, expecting to find the bridge there destroyed. Every other bridge across the river had been blown by retreating German engineers, but the Ludendorff Bridge at Rhine was still standing. Demolition charges had been set and partially fired and had failed to bring it down. American soldiers ran across under fire and seized the far bank. Within days, tens of thousands of troops had crossed. Later that month, in a far larger and more deliberate operation, British and American forces made a full-scale assault, crossing further north. The Rhine, the last great natural barrier protecting Western Germany, was gone. What followed was less a campaign than a collapse. In the industrial region of the Ruhr, an entire German army group of more than 300,000 men was encircled and forced to surrender in April. Across Western Germany, town after town was handed over by local officials without a fight, often against direct orders from Berlin. Those orders had by then taken an extraordinary turn. On the 19th of March, Hitler issued a directive that became known as the Nero Decree. It instructed that everything of value in the path of the advancing Allies be destroyed. Not military installations alone, but bridges, factories, power stations, waterworks, railways, telephone exchanges. The industrial foundation of the country itself. The reasoning behind it was stated openly. Hitler told those around him that if the war was lost, then the German nation had proven itself the weaker one, and its survival was no longer a concern of his. The man responsible for carrying the decree out was Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments. Speer traveled across Western Germany, persuading local commanders and factory managers not to comply, and in some places physically obstructed the demolitions. Most of the decree was never executed. Speer built a good deal of his post-war reputation on that episode, and historians have spent decades questioning how principled it really was. But the decree itself is the clearest single statement of what the German government had become by the spring of 1945. It was prepared to destroy the country it governed rather than hand it over working. And it was in these weeks that Allied soldiers began reaching the concentration camps. What they found there is the subject of another episode in this series, and it deserves that space rather than a passing mention here. But it changed how the men fighting this war understood what they had been fighting. Meanwhile, a decision was taken in the West that historians have argued about ever since. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, chose not to race the Soviets for Berlin. He halted his armies along the Elbe River. His reasoning was practical. Berlin sat well inside the agreed Soviet occupation zone, so any American or British soldiers who died taking it would be dying for territory that would immediately be handed over. He estimated the cost at 100,000 casualties. He judged it, in his own phrase, a poor objective. Churchill disagreed and argued strongly that Berlin carried political weight that outlasted the fighting. He was overruled. The practical result was that the fall of Berlin would be an exclusively Soviet operation. On the 25th of April, at the town of Torgau on the Elbe, American and Soviet patrols met for the first time. There are photographs of the moment, soldiers shaking hands on a wrecked bridge. Germany had been cut in half. 9 days earlier, on the 16th of April, the final assault on Berlin had begun. It opened at the Seelow Heights, a ridge above the Oder floodplain that formed the last defensive position east of the city. Zhukov attacked with an artillery bombardment of extraordinary weight, then switched on 140 anti-aircraft searchlights, pointed directly at the German positions, intending to blind the defenders. It did not work as planned. The light reflected off smoke and dust and silhouetted the advancing Soviet troops instead. The Seelow Heights cost Zhukov several days and heavy casualties before the position fell, but it fell, and behind it there was nothing but the city. Stalin had deliberately set his two leading commanders, Zhukov and Ivan Konev, in competition with one another over who would take Berlin. It made the assault faster and more ruthless. By the 25th of April, their two fronts had closed around the western side of the city. Berlin was encircled. Inside it, the German command structure had become almost entirely detached from reality. Since January, Hitler had been living in a bunker beneath the garden of the Reich Chancellery, an air raid shelter of reinforced concrete some 8 meters below ground. From there, over a military telephone system that increasingly connected to nothing, he issued orders to armies that had ceased to exist. He ordered an SS officer named Felix Steiner to attack the northern flank of the Soviet advance. Steiner had no meaningful force with which to do it. When the attack did not materialize, on the 22nd of April, Hitler suffered a prolonged collapse in front of his staff and admitted, for the first time, that the war was lost. He then continued issuing orders for another week. A relief column under General Walter Wenck was ordered to fight its way into the city. Wenck's army made a serious effort, reached the outskirts, and was stopped. Wenck used what strength he had left to hold open an escape corridor for civilians and retreating soldiers to move west toward American lines rather than Soviet ones. Above ground, the defense of Berlin was being conducted by whoever remained. Regular army units that had fought since 1939 stood alongside police, boys from the Hitler Youth, and elderly men of the Volkssturm militia, many with no training and a single anti-tank weapon between several of them. Fighting moved into subway tunnels, sewers, and the ruins of government buildings. In those same days, the two most powerful men in the regime after Hitler each made a move of their own. Hermann Göring, head of the Air Force and Hitler's designated successor since 1941, was in southern Germany. On the 23rd of April, believing Hitler to be trapped and effectively unable to govern from inside Berlin, he sent a telegram asking whether he should now assume overall leadership of the Reich. He framed it as a request for confirmation of an existing arrangement. Hitler read it as an attempted seizure of power, stripped him of every office he held, and had him arrested by the SS. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, went considerably further. Through a Swedish intermediary, Count Volker Bernadotte, he had been quietly approaching the Western Allies with an offer to surrender German forces in the West while continuing the war in the East. The Allies refused, and word of the approach reached Berlin through a foreign radio broadcast. Of the two betrayals, Himmler's appears to have struck Hitler as the deeper one. Himmler had built his entire career on a claim of absolute personal loyalty. On the 29th of April, in the bunker, Hitler married Eva Braun and dictated a final political testament. In it, he formally expelled both men from the party and named Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, a naval officer who had taken no part in any of this maneuvering, as head of state. On the 30th of April, with Soviet troops fighting their way through the government quarter a few hundred meters away, Adolf Hitler took his own life. Eva Braun died with him. Their bodies were carried up to the Chancellery Garden and burned. That same day, Soviet soldiers reached the Reichstag, the old parliament building, and fought their way through it, floor by floor. A red flag was raised over the building. The famous photograph of that moment was actually staged 2 days later, when the fighting had ended and there was time to arrange it properly. Joseph Goebbels succeeded Hitler as Chancellor for a single day. He and his wife killed themselves and their 6 children on the 1st of May. On the 2nd of May, General Helmuth Weidling, the commander of the Berlin garrison, surrendered the city. Around this same period, roughly 135,000 German troops in the capital went into Soviet captivity. Soviet losses in the Berlin operation ran to around 80,000 dead. But Germany itself had not yet surrendered. For the following week, the government under Dönitz, operating from the far north of the country, pursued a specific and cynical strategy. It tried to surrender piecemeal to the Western Allies while keeping the Eastern Front open, so that as many German soldiers and civilians as possible could move west and avoid Soviet captivity. It worked, partially. German forces in Italy surrendered at the end of April. On the 4th of May, German forces in northwest Germany, the Netherlands and Denmark surrendered to Field Marshal Montgomery on Lüneburg Heath. But the Allies refused to accept a general surrender in the West alone. They had committed to each other since 1943 that Germany would surrender unconditionally to all of them at the same time. On the 7th of May, in a schoolhouse in Rennes, France, that was serving as Eisenhower's headquarters, General Alfred Jodl signed the Act of Unconditional Military Surrender. It was to take effect at 11 on the night of the 8th of May. Stalin objected. The surrender had been signed on Western Allied ground, with a relatively junior Soviet representative present, and the Soviet Union had carried the overwhelming share of the fighting in Europe. He demanded a second, definitive signing in Berlin. So it was done twice. Late on the 8th of May, in a former engineering school in the Berlin district of Karlshorst, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed the surrender again, before Marshal Zhukov. By the time that signature was dry, it was past midnight in Moscow. That single detail is why Victory in Europe Day is remembered on the 8th of May in Britain, France, and the United States, and on the 9th of May in Russia. Not a dispute about facts, a dispute about time zones and about who deserved to preside over the ending. In London and New York, enormous crowds filled the streets. In Berlin, there was no celebration. The city had lost most of its housing, most of its water supply, and a large part of its population, either dead or fled or taken prisoner. Across Europe, millions of displaced people began walking home or looking for somewhere that would take them. The scale of that is difficult to hold in the mind. Somewhere in the region of 8 million German soldiers passed into Allied captivity in the weeks around the surrender. Roughly 11 million people across Europe were classified as displaced persons, meaning they were alive in a country not their own, with no way home and no government clearly responsible for them. Millions of German civilians were moving west out of territory that would never be German again. Feeding and sheltering those people became the first task of the occupying powers, well before any question of politics or justice could be taken up. And the war was not over. That is the detail most easily forgotten about the 8th of May, 1945. On that date, Japan was still fighting. American forces were still taking casualties on Okinawa. 3 more months of the Pacific War remained, and the decision that would end it had not yet been made. Europe, though, was finished with this war. What it now had instead was a continent occupied by 2 powers who had just fought as allies, facing one another across a line that ran through the middle of a defeated Germany. That line would harden into a border. That border would last until 1989. In the next episode, we go to the Pacific and to the 2 decisions that ended the deadliest war in human history.